The cockpit smelled like burnt oil and blood. Captain Daniel Hartwell could taste both in the back of his throat as he forced his eyes to focus on the instrument panel. The altimeter needle trembled at 11,000 feet, maybe 12. His vision kept splitting the dial in two. Outside the shattered windscreen, grey English sky rushed past at 200 miles per hour. The B-17's number 3 engine was dead, trailing black smoke. Number 4 was running hot, its temperature gauge buried in the red. The entire aircraft shuddered like a wounded animal trying to stay airborne. It was March 17th, 1943. They had crossed back over the channel 11 minutes ago after a daylight raid on Bremen. The formation had been torn apart by flak and fighters over the target. Hartwell's plane, a flying fortress named Sarah's Promise after his wife back in Ohio, had taken a direct hit from an 88mm shell just as they released their bombs. The explosion had torn through the radio room, killed the radio man instantly, and sent shrapnel through the bulkhead into the waist. 2 gunners were down. The tail gunner wasn't responding on the interphone. Hartwell didn't know if he was dead or if the system was just shot to hell. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Kearney, sat slumped against his harness. Blood soaked through the left shoulder of his flight suit. A piece of flak the size of a quarter had punched through the cockpit wall and caught him just below the collarbone. Kearney's face was white. His breathing came in short, painful gasps. He'd passed out twice in the last 20 minutes. Hartwell had slapped him awake both times, needed him conscious, needed another pair of hands on the controls. But Kearney was fading. His right hand rested uselessly in his lap. His left barely held the yoke. The bomber was losing altitude at 300 feet per minute. Hartwell had both hands locked on his control column, fighting to keep the nose up. His shoulders burned from the effort. The aircraft wanted to roll left, wanted to spiral down into the farmland below. He could see it through breaks in the cloud cover, patchwork fields, stone walls, narrow roads. England. Home. Except they weren't going to make it home. RAF Thurley was 40 miles northeast. They'd never cover that distance, not with 2 engines gone and the airframe coming apart. The navigator, Sergeant Paul Ridgway, climbed up through the hatch behind Hartwell's seat. His face was streaked with hydraulic fluid. "Skipper, we got fire in the number 4 nacelle. I can see flames through the cowling." Hartwell didn't take his eyes off the horizon. "Feather it." "Already tried." "Controls aren't responding." "Then we shut it down and hope it doesn't spread." Hartwell's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking on the yoke. "Get everyone on walk-around oxygen. Check the wounded. I want a count." Ridgway hesitated. "Sir, Bailey's gone. Nichols took shrapnel in both legs. Morgan's trying to stop the bleeding. Connolly in the tail isn't answering. Go check on him." "Yes, sir." Ridgway dropped back through the hatch. Hartwell watched the altimeter spin down. 9,000 feet. The number 4 engine coughed, backfired, and the propeller stopped turning. Good. At least it wasn't going to catch fire and blow the wing off. But now they were down to 2 engines on the right side and none on the left. The asymmetric thrust was brutal. He stood on the right rudder pedal with everything he had, trying to keep the nose straight. His right leg was cramping. His lower back felt like someone was driving a spike into it. Kearney's head lolled to the side. Hartwell reached over and shook him. "Jimmy, stay with me." Kearney's eyes fluttered open. "Can't. Dan, I can't. You don't have to do anything, just stay awake. Talk to me. We're going in, aren't we?" "Not if I can help it." But Hartwell knew it was a lie. The question wasn't if, it was where and when, and whether any of them would walk away from it. He'd been flying B-17s for 8 months, 21 missions over Germany and occupied France. He'd seen planes go down, watched them explode in midair, watched them spin into the ground, trailing fire and smoke. He'd seen parachutes blossom against the sky and prayed the men got out before the fighters came back around. He'd lost friends. Good men. Boys, most of them, barely old enough to vote. He carried their names in his head like stones. Hartwell was 32 years old, older than most of the pilots in the group. He'd been a flight instructor before the war, teaching rich kids how to fly Stearmans at a civilian field outside Akron. When Pearl Harbor happened, he'd enlisted the next day. Sarah had cried. They'd been married 3 years. No kids yet. She'd made him promise he'd come home. He'd promised. Now he wasn't sure he could keep it. 7,000 feet. The clouds broke apart and the ground came into view. Rolling hills, stone farmhouses with slate roofs, a village with a church steeple, roads, hedgerows. Hartwell scanned for a place to put the plane down. He needed flat ground, needed length, a grass field, a pasture, anything. But everything below was cut up into small parcels, divided by walls and fences. There was no room for a B-17. The bomber needed at least 1,000 yards to land. More if the brakes were shot, which they probably were. He spotted something to the north. A ridgeline, bare of trees, long and relatively flat. Maybe 800 yards. Not enough. But it was the best option he'd seen. He banked right, shallow, careful not to stall. The aircraft groaned. Metal scraped against metal somewhere in the fuselage. He could hear wind screaming through the holes in the skin. Ridgway came back on the interphone. "Skipper, Connolly's alive. He's hurt bad. Took a 20mm round through the tail section. He's unconscious but breathing. Get him forward. Get everyone forward. We're putting her down in 2 minutes." "Roger." Kearney turned his head slowly. "Dan, I'm sorry." "Save it." Hartwell's jaw was clenched so hard his teeth ached. "You didn't do anything wrong. Should have seen that fighter coming. Neither of us saw it. Forget it." But Kearney was right. They should have seen it. The Me-109 had come up from below, nearly vertical, and put a long burst into the belly of the plane before anyone could react. It was luck they hadn't exploded right there. Luck the bombs were already gone. Luck the fuel tanks didn't rupture. Hartwell didn't believe in luck anymore. He believed in God, though he hadn't prayed much lately. He'd seen too much. Done too much. Dropped bombs on cities where people lived. Women. Children. He told himself it was war. Told himself it was necessary, but the weight of it sat on his chest every night when he tried to sleep. 5,000 feet. The ridgeline was directly ahead, maybe 3 miles out. He could see cows in a field. A farmer standing by a gate, looking up. The sound of the damaged engines would be deafening from the ground. Hartwell lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic pump whined. The gear indicators showed 2 greens, nose and left main. The right main was stuck. He recycled the lever. Nothing. The indicator stayed dark. "Jimmy, we got a problem." Kearney blinked, trying to focus. "What?" "Right main won't lock." "Manual release?" "Yeah. I need you to pull it." Kearney looked down at his wounded shoulder, then at the release handle between the seats. It required 2 hands and a hard pull. He shook his head weakly. "I can't." Hartwell cursed under his breath. He couldn't leave the controls. Not now. If he let go, the plane would roll, and they'd go in inverted. He keyed the interphone. "Ridgway, get back up here, now." "On my way." 4,000 feet. The ridge was close. Too close. Hartwell cut power on the 2 remaining engines. The sudden silence was eerie. Just wind and the groan of the airframe. The plane was a glider now, a 65,000-pound glider with no margin for error. He adjusted the trim, trying to stretch the descent, but the damaged control surfaces weren't responding properly. The aircraft wallowed. The right wing dipped. He caught it, leveled out, but he was bleeding off airspeed fast. 130 knots. 120. If he got too slow, she'd stall and drop like a rock. Ridgway appeared behind him. "Sir?" "Right main gear. Manual release, pull it hard." Ridgway grabbed the handle and threw his weight into it. The cables snapped free. The gear dropped. The indicator light flickered, then turned green. "Good. Get back and strap in." 3,000 feet. The ridge filled the windscreen. Hartwell could see individual rocks, patches of dead grass, a line of fence posts. He was coming in too fast, too steep. He pulled back on the yoke, trying to flare, but the nose wouldn't come up. The hydraulics were gone. He was flying on cables and willpower. Kearney whispered something. Hartwell couldn't hear it over the wind. "What?" "Sarah. Tell Sarah I'm sorry. You'll tell her yourself." But Hartwell's voice cracked. He could see the ground rushing up, could see the end of the ridge, a drop-off beyond it, trees. There wasn't enough room. They were going to overshoot. Going to hit the trees at 100 miles an hour. Going to die here, in a muddy field in England, less than an hour after they'd thought they were safe. He thought about Sarah, thought about the promise he'd made, thought about the men behind him, boys who trusted him to get them home. Thought about all the missions, all the close calls, all the times he'd beaten the odds. This was where it ended. Not over Germany, not in fire and flak, but here, now, in sight of safety. The wheels touched. The right gear collapsed immediately. The bomber slammed down on its belly. Sparks flew, metal screamed. The world became noise and violence. Hartwell's head snapped forward. His harness cut into his chest. The control column punched him in the ribs. The ridge was uneven, studded with rocks. The fuselage buckled. Rivets popped. The left wing dug into the ground and started to tear away. Then everything stopped. Hartwell opened his eyes. He was hanging forward in his harness. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eyebrow. The windscreen was gone. Cold air poured into the cockpit. He could smell aviation fuel. Strong, close. He turned his head. Kearney was unconscious, bleeding from his nose and mouth. Behind him, someone was screaming. He had to move, had to get them out. The plane was broken, leaking fuel, and if it caught fire, they'd burn alive. He fumbled with his harness release. His hands wouldn't work right. His fingers were numb. Finally, the buckle came free. He pulled himself out of the seat, grabbed Kearney under the arms, and dragged him toward the hatch. The rest of the crew were already climbing out through the waist. Ridgway appeared, helped him with Kearney. They lowered him through the hatch onto the grass. Morgan and Nichols were next. Nichols pale and shaking, his legs wrapped in torn fabric. Someone had gotten Connolly out of the tail. He was breathing but not conscious. Hartwell counted heads. 8 men. 2 dead. Everyone else alive. For now. He looked back at the plane. Sarah's promise was finished. The fuselage was cracked in 2 places. The left wing hung at an angle. Fuel was pooling under the belly. A thin trail of smoke rose from the number 4 engine. Hartwell watched it, waiting for the spark, waiting for the flame that would end everything. But it didn't come. In the distance, he heard the sound of a truck. Someone must have seen them come down. Help was on the way. They'd made it. Barely. By inches and seconds. But they were down. They were alive. Except Hartwell didn't feel alive. He felt hollow. Empty. He knelt in the mud next to Kearney and pressed his hand to the wound on his shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. Kearney's breathing was shallow. His skin was cold. Hartwell didn't know if he'd make it. Didn't know if any of them would recover from this. Not just the wounds. The other thing. The weight. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, covered in blood and oil. He'd gotten them down, done his job. But all he could think about was the bombs they'd dropped over Bremen, the fires they'd started, the people below, and he wondered, not for the first time, what any of it was for. The truck arrived. Men in British Army uniforms jumped out. A medic ran toward them. Hartwell stood, stepped back, let them take over. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred. Someone asked him a question, but he couldn't make out the words. He just stood there watching the smoke rise from the wreckage and wondered if he'd ever be able to keep the promise he'd made to Sarah, because even if his body made it home, he wasn't sure the rest of him would. If you want to know what happened next, whether Kearney survived, whether Hartwell found a way to carry the weight, and what became of the men who climbed out of that broken plane, stay with me to the end. The field hospital at RAF Thurley smelled like disinfectant and wet wool. Hartwell sat on a metal stool in the corner of the ward, watching a nurse change the dressing on Kearney's shoulder. It had been 3 days since the crash. 3 days of debriefings, paperwork, and waiting. Kearney had lost a lot of blood. The doctors said he'd live, but he wouldn't fly again. The wound had damaged nerves. His left arm would never work quite right. Hartwell's own injuries were minor. A concussion, bruised ribs, a gash above his eye that took 6 stitches. Nothing that would keep him grounded. The flight surgeon had cleared him for duty yesterday. He was expected back in the rotation within a week. Another mission, another target, another chance to get it wrong. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the altimeter spinning down, felt the controls go slack in his hands, heard the screaming metal and the impact and the silence that came after. He'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, convinced he was still in the cockpit fighting to keep the nose up. The other men from Sarah's promise were scattered across the hospital. Nichols had surgery on both legs. The doctors saved them, but he'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Connolly had a fractured skull and internal bleeding. He was stable now, but it had been close. Morgan and Ridgway had minor injuries. They'd be back to flying within days. The 2 dead, Bailey and Staff Sergeant Thomas Rucker, the radio man, had been buried at the American Cemetery in Cambridge. Hartwell had attended both services, stood in the rain and listened to a chaplain say words that meant nothing. Kearney's eyes opened. He looked around slowly, found Hartwell in the corner. "You're still here. Nowhere else to be. You should get some rest." "So should you." Hartwell stood, walked over to the bed. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. They're giving me morphine every 4 hours." Kearney's voice was hoarse. "Doc says I'm going home. Medical discharge." Hartwell nodded. He'd expected it. "That's good. Sarah will be happy to see you back." "She'll be happier to see you. You're writing to her, right?" "I wrote yesterday." "What did you tell her?" "That we made it. That you're okay." Hartwell looked down at his hands. "Didn't mention the rest. The rest is what she needs to know." Kearney shifted in the bed, winced. "Dan, you saved our lives. You put that plane down in an impossible situation. If anyone else had been flying, we'd all be dead." Hartwell didn't respond. He'd heard the same thing from the other crew members, from the CO, from the investigators who'd gone over the wreckage. Everyone wanted to call it a miracle, wanted to pin a medal on him and add it to the official record. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, that saving 8 men didn't balance against all the others. The ones in Bremen, the ones in Hamburg and Cologne and every other target they'd hit. "You don't believe me," Kearney said. "I believe you think it's true. What's eating you?" Hartwell sat down on the edge of the bed. He was quiet for a long time. The ward was full of wounded men, pilots with burns, gunners with frostbite, navigators who'd bailed out over Germany and spent weeks evading capture. Everyone had a story. Everyone carried something. "I keep thinking about Bremen," Hartwell said finally. "We dropped our payload right on target. I saw the explosions, saw the fires start. And I know we hit more than factories. We always do. The bombs don't care. They fall and they kill whoever's underneath." Kearney was quiet. Then, "It's war, Dan. We don't get to choose." "Maybe we do. Maybe every time we climb into that cockpit and start the engines, we're choosing. And maybe that choice costs something." "You think too much." "I think enough." Hartwell stood. "I'll let you rest. Dan." Kearney reached out with his good hand, grabbed Hartwell's sleeve. "You're a good man, a good pilot. Don't lose sight of that." Hartwell pulled his arm free gently. "I'll see you tomorrow." He walked out of the ward into the cold March afternoon. The sky was overcast. A light rain was falling. He could hear aircraft in the distance, B-17s returning from a mission. He counted them as they appeared through the clouds. 12, 13, 14. The group had sent out 20. 6 weren't coming back. Somewhere over Germany, 6 crews had gone down. 60 men, give or take. Some might have bailed out. Most were probably dead. Hartwell walked across the base to the chapel. It was a small building, wooden, with a simple cross above the door. He hadn't been inside since Christmas, hadn't prayed in weeks. But he pushed open the door and went in anyway. The chapel was empty. Rows of plain benches. A table at the front with a Bible on it. A single window, stained glass showing a dove. Hartwell sat in the back row and stared at the cross. He'd grown up Methodist, gone to church every Sunday until he left home. His mother had made him memorize verses. His father had been a deacon. They'd taught him that God had a plan, that faith meant trusting even when you didn't understand. He didn't understand any of this. Captain Hartwell. He turned. The chaplain, Father Mackenzie, stood in the doorway. He was a thin man, mid-50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and grey hair. He'd been with the group since they deployed to England. Hartwell had spoken to him a few times, found him reasonable, less preachy than some. Father. Mackenzie walked down the aisle and sat on the bench across from him. I heard about the landing. Hell of a thing. You brought them home. Most of them. Most is more than none. Mackenzie folded his hands in his lap. You look like a man with something on his mind. Hartwell didn't answer right away. Then, how do you do it? How do you keep believing when everything you see contradicts it? Contradicts what? That there's meaning in any of this. That God's paying attention. That the people we kill matter less than the people we save. Mackenzie was quiet for a moment. I don't think they matter less. Then why are we here? Because evil exists. Because someone has to stand against it. Because if we don't, more people will die. More people are dying anyway. We're just choosing which ones. Yes. Mackenzie looked at him. And that's the burden you carry. The weight of the choice. But that weight doesn't make the choice wrong. It makes you human. Hartwell rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know if I can keep doing this. You can. You will. Because your men need you. Because the war isn't over. Because you made a promise to your wife and you intend to keep it. Mackenzie leaned forward. Faith isn't about understanding, Captain. It's about trust. Trusting that the God who made you also sustains you. That he sees the burden you carry. That he doesn't ask you to carry it alone. Feels like I am. Then you're not looking hard enough. Mackenzie stood. Come to me if you need to talk. Anytime. Day or night. He left. Hartwell sat alone in the chapel for another hour. He didn't pray. Didn't know what to say. Just sat and listened to the rain on the roof and the distant sound of engines. A week later, Hartwell was back in the cockpit. New crew, new copilot. A replacement B-17 called Resolute. The mission was Wilhelmshaven, a U-boat pen on the coast. The briefing officer said it was a hard target, heavily defended. Expected losses were high. Hartwell listened, made notes and tried not to think about the odds. They took off at 0600, climbed through the clouds into sunlight, formed up with the rest of the group and turned east. The channel was grey and cold below. Hartwell checked his instruments. Everything was green. The engines were running smooth. The new co-pilot, a lieutenant named Davis, was competent but quiet. He'd flown 15 missions, lost his last pilot to flak over Essen. He didn't talk much. Hartwell didn't mind. They crossed into German airspace at 10,000 feet. The flak started immediately. Black puffs in the sky, close enough to rock the plane. The formation tightened. Hartwell held his position, checked the group. Everyone was still there, still flying. Then the fighters came, Me-109s and FW-190s, diving out of the sun. The interphone exploded with voices, gunners calling out positions. Fighters at 12 o'clock high, 3 o'clock level, 6 o'clock low. The 50s opened up, rattling the entire aircraft. Spent casings bounced on the cockpit floor. Hartwell kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the yoke. A B-17 to his left took a direct hit. The cockpit exploded. The plane nosed over and fell away, trailing fire. No parachutes. Hartwell didn't watch it go. He couldn't afford to. Had to focus on the formation, on the target, on getting there and getting back. The bomb run took 6 minutes. 6 minutes of straight and level flight, while the bombardier lined up the sight. 6 minutes of flak so thick it looked like a black curtain. 6 minutes of praying the plane didn't take a hit in the fuel tanks or the bomb bay. Hartwell felt every second stretch out, felt the weight of the bombs beneath him, felt the weight of what they'd do when they fell. Bombs away. The plane lurched upward. The load was gone. Hartwell banked left, following the leader heading for home. The fighters followed them halfway across the channel. 2 more bombers went down. One exploded in midair, the other ditched in the water. Hartwell saw the crew climbing into a life raft before the plane sank. Maybe the Navy would pick them up. Maybe not. They landed at Thurley at 1400. Hartwell taxied to the hard stand, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for 5 minutes. His hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked with sweat. Davis looked at him. "You okay, sir?" "Yeah, I'm okay." But he wasn't. He climbed out of the plane, walked to the debriefing, answered the questions, and signed the forms. Then he went to his quarters, lay down on his bunk, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the bombs falling, about the fires starting, about the people below who didn't have a choice, who didn't get to climb into a cockpit and fly away. He thought about Kearney's words. "You saved our lives." And Mackenzie's. "You're not carrying it alone." He didn't know if he believed either of them, but he knew he'd be in the cockpit again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because it was his job, because the war wasn't over, because he'd made a promise, and because somewhere in the wreckage and the smoke and the fear, there was still something worth saving. Hartwell flew 12 more missions before the end of April. Each one was harder than the last. Not because of the danger, though the danger was real, constant, unrelenting, but because of the weight, the accumulation of choices, of targets, of faces he'd never see but would never forget. In May, the group took casualties so severe they were pulled off operations for 2 weeks. Hartwell used the time to write letters. To Sarah, to Kearney, who was back in Ohio recuperating, to the families of Bailey and Rucker. He didn't know what to say to them, didn't know how to explain that their sons had died quickly, that they hadn't suffered, when he didn't know if any of that was true. He wrote the letters anyway, sealed them, mailed them, and tried not to think about the weight of those words. One evening, he walked back to the crash site, the ridge where Sarah's promise had come apart. The wreckage was gone. The British had salvaged what they could and scrapped the rest. But the scar was still there. A long furrow in the grass, broken rocks, scorched earth. Hartwell stood at the edge and looked down the slope, tried to see it the way it had been. The plane skidding, braking, coming to rest. The crew climbing out. The moment when they realized they'd survived. He thought about that moment a lot. The silence after the crash, the absence of fire, the strange, fragile gift of continued life. It didn't make sense. He'd seen planes burn with men trapped inside. Seen men bail out only to be shot in their parachutes. Seen luck run out in 1,000 different ways. But that day, on that ridge, it hadn't. They'd made it. 8 out of 10. He didn't know if it was God or chance or something in between. Didn't know if the question even mattered. What mattered was what he did with it, with the time he'd been given, with the weight he carried. The sun was setting. The sky was turning orange and purple. Hartwell stood there until it was dark, then walked back to base. He had a mission in the morning. Berlin. Deep penetration. High losses expected. He'd fly it. Do his job. Try to bring his crew home. And maybe, if he was lucky, he'd figure out what it all meant before the weight crushed him. The war ended in May 1945. Hartwell was still flying, still carrying the weight. He'd completed 47 missions by the time Germany surrendered. More than most. More than he'd expected to survive. When the orders came to stand down, to pack up and prepare to redeploy or go home, he didn't feel relief. He felt empty. He went home to Ohio in June. Sarah met him at the train station in Akron. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair was different. She smiled when she saw him, but there was something careful in her eyes, something that knew he'd changed. They didn't talk much on the drive home. She asked about the flight, about the crew. He gave short answers. She didn't push. When they reached the house, she made dinner. They ate in silence. Afterward, he sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. Sarah sat beside him. "You're not the same," she said. "No. Do you want to talk about it?" "I don't know how." She took his hand, held it, didn't say anything else. Hartwell looked at the sky. No contrails, No smoke, no flak, just stars. He thought about the ridge in England, about the moment after the crash when he'd stood in the mud and wondered if he'd ever be whole again. He still didn't know the answer. Maybe he never would. But Sarah's hand was warm. The night was quiet, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to breathe. Years later, long after the war had faded into memory, long after the nightmares had become less frequent and the weight had settled into something he could carry, Hartwell returned to England. He was 63. Sarah had passed 2 years earlier. Cancer. The doctors had done what they could. It wasn't enough. He'd been alone since then. His children lived in other states. He didn't see them often. He flew into London and rented a car, drove north to the village near RAF Thurley. The base was gone, converted to civilian use, but the ridge was still there. He parked on the side of the road and walked into the field. It was summer. The grass was tall. Wildflowers grew in patches. Birds sang. He found the scar. Faint now, barely visible. The earth had healed. Hartwell stood where the cockpit had been and looked down the slope. He could almost see it. The broken plane, the smoke, the crew climbing out, the moment of grace. He knelt in the grass. His knees hurt. His back hurt. He was old now, tired, but he'd made it. Kept the promise to Sarah, more or less. Lived a life, raised children, worked, loved, carried the weight. He thought about Kearney, dead 10 years now, heart attack. He thought about the others, Bailey, Rucker, all the men who hadn't made it home, all the people below the bombs, the weight of all those lives. And he thought about the words Mackenzie had said in the chapel, "You're not carrying it alone." Hartwell stayed on the ridge until the sun set. Then he stood, brushed off his knees and walked back to the car. He didn't know if he believed in God anymore. Didn't know if any of it had mattered. But he knew he'd tried. Knew he'd done his best with what he'd been given. That would have to be enough. He drove back to London in the dark, returned the car and flew home to Ohio. He never went back to England. Never spoke about the war again. When he died 3 years later, his children found a box in his closet. Inside were his medals, his logbook, and a single photograph. The crew of Sarah's Promise, standing in front of the plane before the mission to Bremen. 10 young men, smiling, unaware of what was coming. On the back of the photograph, in Hartwell's handwriting, was a single line. They deserved better than this. We all did. His children didn't understand what it meant. They kept the box anyway, passed it down. A mystery, a weight, a reminder that some stories don't have answers, only echoes. And somewhere in England, in a field where a B-17 once fell from the sky and somehow didn't burn, the grass grows tall and the birds sing, and the earth remembers what was paid for every moment of peace that followed.